New York City, November 1983. The frost-kissed air carried whispers of the approaching winter as evening descended on Madison Avenue. Inside the penthouse suite of the Pierre Hotel, the atmosphere was heavy with a different kind of tension, the particular pressure that accompanies decisions with the potential to reshape public perception. Light from crystal chandeliers reflected off the polished surfaces of the expansive room, creating an illusion of warmth that belied the emotional complexity contained within its walls. Michael Jackson stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, his slender silhouette outlined against the New York skyline, fingers absently tracing patterns on the cold glass as he watched the city lights emerge like stars against the darkening canvas of dusk. At 25, he had already lived several lifetimes in the public eye. From child prodigy to global phenomenon, his journey observed, dissected, and commodified by millions who felt ownership over his talent without understanding the human being who housed it. The Thriller album had transformed him from star to supernova, each day bringing new heights of fame that simultaneously validated and isolated him. Tonight, however, his thoughts weren't on record sales or upcoming performances, but on a decision both intensely personal and inevitably public. How to address what was happening to his hands, to his skin, to his physical self that seemed increasingly to be transforming beyond his control. Behind him, scattered across the suite's elegant furniture, his closest advisors waited with uncharacteristic patience. His manager, always calculating the commercial implications of every move. His dermatologist, armed with medical explanations and treatment options. His costume designer, present at Michael's specific request, though uncertain why her aesthetic expertise was needed for what had been described as a medical consultation. What connected these disparate professionals was absolute discretion. Each had signed confidentiality agreements with consequences severe enough to ensure silence. What they were about to discuss would not leave this room, would not find its way to the tabloids that increasingly monitored Michael's every movement with predatory intensity. What the world didn't know, what Michael had concealed with increasing difficulty, was the condition gradually transforming his skin. Vitiligo, the dermatologist had finally diagnosed after months of uncertainty, a disease causing patches of skin to lose pigmentation. For most patients, it represented a cosmetic challenge, difficult but manageable. For Michael Jackson, whose physical appearance was scrutinized with unprecedented intensity, whose racial identity was integral to his cultural significance, it carried implications far beyond the medical. The first spot had appeared 3 years earlier, a small patch of lightened skin on his right hand that he had initially dismissed as a temporary anomaly. But it had spread, joined by others, creating a mottled pattern that costume departments now spend hours covering with makeup before performances that required constant vigilance during public appearances that had begun to fuel whispers and speculation in industry circles. "It's accelerating," the dermatologist said, breaking the silence that had settled over the room. Michael turned from the window, his expression revealing nothing of the emotional turmoil beneath. Years of performing, of maintaining composure under the most intense scrutiny, had given him mastery over his visible reactions. Only his eyes, unusually expressive in contrast to his carefully composed features, betrayed the complexity of his response. "How long?" he asked, the question containing multitudes. How long until it's impossible to hide? How long until the public notices? How long until I no longer recognize myself in the mirror? The dermatologist hesitated, understanding the layers behind the simple query. "The pattern is unpredictable," she admitted. "Some patients stabilize. Others experience a complete depigmentation over time. What we're seeing in your case suggests the latter is more likely, particularly on your hands and face." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The treatments we've tried have limited effectiveness. We can continue them, but I believe we should also discuss strategies for managing the visible aspects as the condition progresses." Michael nodded once, a slight movement containing absolute comprehension. He had suspected this conclusion even before the meeting was arranged, had seen the truth written on his own skin despite the increasingly elaborate efforts to conceal it. He turned to the costume designer, whose presence now took on new significance. "I need something," he said, his voice carrying that characteristic softness that always surprised those who knew him only through recordings or performances. Something that can be part of the performance, part of the image, but also serve a practical purpose. Something that can hide what's happening to my hand while the makeup becomes increasingly difficult to maintain during shows. The designer, accustomed to translating artistic vision into tangible reality, understood immediately. "A glove," she said, the simplicity of the solution belying its potential impact. A single glove that becomes not a medical necessity, but a style choice, a signature element. Michael's expression shifted subtly, interest replacing resignation. The designer continued, warming to the concept. "We make it distinctive, not just functional coverage, but a statement piece. Rhinestones, perhaps. Sequins. Something that catches the light during performances, that draws the eye intentionally rather than allowing it to notice what you're trying to conceal." Something in Michael's posture changed. The subtle straightening of shoulders, the lift of chin, the physical manifestation of a mind shifting from problem to possibility. This was familiar territory, this transformation of necessity into art, this alchemical process of turning limitation into creative opportunity. Throughout his career, from the controlled environment of Motown to the artistic freedom of his solo work, he had repeatedly found ways to convert constraint into innovation. "One glove," he said, the words emerging slowly as the concept took shape in his mind. "Just the right hand, where it's most visible, most advanced. Not a pair. That would seem like a costume choice, like an accessory anyone might select. But one glove becomes something else entirely. Something signature. Something mysterious." If this story moves you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from music history. Moments when necessity birthed innovation, when personal struggle led to iconic creation. These glimpses behind the carefully constructed images remind us that our most distinctive expressions often emerge from our most difficult challenges. What unfolded over the next hour in that penthouse suite was a creative collaboration that would ultimately produce one of pop culture's most recognizable symbols. The manager, initially skeptical of how audiences might receive such an unusual accessory, gradually recognized its potential as both practical solution and marketing distinction. The dermatologist provided parameters for what materials would work best against increasingly sensitive skin. The designer sketched possibilities, different shapes, embellishments, materials, each responding to both the medical necessity and the artistic opportunity the glove represented. Michael moved between them, considering each suggestion with a meticulous attention to detail that characterized his approach to every aspect of his craft. By midnight, they had settled on the initial design, a single white glove for the right hand, fitted precisely to Michael's measurements, covered with rhinestones that would catch and reflect stage lighting. The first prototype would be ready within days, additional versions with variations and embellishment to follow. What had begun as a medical consultation had transformed into a creative birthing, the conception of what would become not just a practical solution to a private struggle, but a cultural icon recognized around the world. As his team gathered their materials, preparing to implement the plan they had collectively developed, Michael returned to the window, his reflection now visible against the backdrop of nighttime Manhattan. He studied his own image, the face that had become among the most famous on the planet, the body that had revolutionized movement and performance, the hands that were now beginning to reflect a physical transformation beyond his control. In that moment of private reckoning, visible to no one but himself, he allowed his carefully maintained composure to soften, permitted himself to acknowledge the grief of unwanted change, of difference, of the particular burden of navigating personal medical reality under the world's most unforgiving spotlight. 3 weeks later, at the Pasadena Civic Auditorium, the Motown 25 television special provided the perfect stage for the glove's debut. As Michael prepared in his dressing room, the newly created accessory rested on a small velvet cushion beside his other costume elements. He had rehearsed with it extensively, adjusting his choreography to incorporate its presence, finding ways to make it integral to his movement rather than incidental. The costume designer watched as he carefully slipped it onto his right hand, the hand where vitiligo had spread most noticeably, where conventional makeup had become increasingly ineffective at creating the appearance of evenness. The glove fit perfectly, transforming the medical necessity of coverage into an artistic statement. "How does it feel?" she asked, the question encompassing both physical comfort and emotional impact. Michael flexed his fingers, watching as the rhinestones caught the light, transformed ordinary movement into something that seemed almost magical. "It feels right," he said, and the simplicity of the statement belied its profound truth. The glove wasn't just hiding something. It was revealing something else, his ability to transform personal challenge into creative expression, private struggle into public art. For the first time since the diagnosis, since the appearance of those first patches of depigmented skin, he felt a sense of control returning, of agency, in how his changing body would be perceived. The condition itself remained beyond his power to alter, but its presentation to the world, its integration into his artistic identity, these were choices he could make, expressions he could shape. What happened next entered music history. Michael's performance of Billie Jean, that introduced the moonwalk to a global audience, that transformed him from music star to cultural phenomenon. The single white glove, catching and reflecting light with each precise movement, became instantly iconic. What the millions watching couldn't know, was that they were witnessing not just artistic innovation, but personal transformation. The moment when Michael Jackson converted private struggle into public signature, when necessary concealment became deliberate revelation of a different kind. In the days and weeks that followed the Motown 25 broadcast, the public response to the glove was immediate and overwhelming. Fashion magazines analyzed it as aesthetic choice. Fans created homemade versions. Merchandise manufacturers rushed to produce authorized replicas. What had originated as practical solution became cultural shorthand, visual signature immediately associated with a single artist. For Michael, watching this response unfold, there was profound irony in how completely the world embraced what had begun as concealment of something he feared they would reject. The glove's success confirmed what he had always intuited about his audience, about people in general, that they responded most powerfully to what felt authentic, distinctive, true, even when they didn't understand its complete context or origin. As his vitiligo progressed over the years that followed, as the condition that had begun with small patches gradually transformed larger areas of his skin, the glove remained constant, evolving in design details, but consistent in purpose and meaning. Additional strategies became necessary. Specialized makeup, treatments that helped even his skin tone by reducing pigmentation in unaffected areas, strategic choices in clothing and lighting. But the glove, that first creative response to unwanted change, retained its special significance for Michael. It represented a pivotal moment when he had chosen to meet a deeply personal challenge with artistic transformation, when necessity had birthed an element of his performance so distinctive it became inseparable from his public identity. What the public never fully understood, what most never even questioned, was why only one hand received this treatment, why the glove was never a pair. Speculation ranged from the aesthetic to the absurd. It was purely for visual effect. It represented the duality of his musical influences. It was a tribute to earlier performers. It helped with grip during dance moves. The truth, that it had begun as medical necessity, as concealment of a condition that made his skin lose pigmentation in patterns he couldn't control, remained private, protected by those who understood its significance, who recognized that some aspects of even the most public life deserve the dignity of privacy. The irony deepened as Michael's appearance changed more dramatically over time, as tabloids and commentators developed increasingly outlandish theories about his changing skin tone, that he was bleaching his skin, rejecting his racial identity, attempting to appear white. The truth, documented in his autopsy but dismissed or ignored by those committed to more sensational narratives, was the progression of vitiligo to near-complete depigmentation, supplemented by medical treatments, to even the remaining patches by reducing pigment in unaffected areas. The glove, which had begun as concealment of the first visible evidence of this condition, became a historical marker of sorts. The moment when private medical reality began its long, complex intersection with public persona, with the mythology that increasingly surrounded one of the world's most visible yet least understood human beings. Years later, in rare, unguarded moments, Michael would occasionally reference the glove's origin to those in his innermost circle. "It's strange," he told his longtime costume designer during preparations for the History Tour, "how something that began as hiding became the thing everyone associated with revealing the performer, the artist." He held a newer version of the glove, this one more elaborately decorated than the original, but serving the same dual purpose of concealment and signature. Maybe that's always how it works. The things we create to protect our most vulnerable parts become the aspects of ourselves most recognizable to the world. The insight, delivered casually between decisions about stage costuming, revealed the philosophical depth that those closest to Michael recognized, but that his public persona, increasingly shaped by external forces beyond his control, rarely had space to express. For the collectors and museums that would eventually house various iterations of the glove, its significance remained primarily cultural, historical, aesthetic. The rhinestone-covered accessory represented a moment in entertainment history, an iconic element of a legendary performer's visual identity. Few knew or acknowledged its deeper meaning, its origin in medical necessity, its transformation of private challenge into public signature. The official placards offered dates, materials, performance history. But for those who had witnessed its conception, who understood the courage required to transform unwanted physical change into deliberate artistic choice, the glove represented something more profound. The particular alchemy that allows human beings to convert limitation into innovation, vulnerability into strength, concealment into a different kind of truth. In his final years, as health challenges multiplied and public scrutiny intensified, the glove made fewer appearances. Its practical necessity diminished as more comprehensive approaches to managing his skin condition evolved, its symbolic weight sometimes too heavy to bear amid the cacophony of sensationalism that increasingly surrounded him. But it remained in his consciousness, a tangible reminder of that moment in a New York hotel suite, when he had chosen creative transformation over surrender to circumstance, when he had found a way to maintain control of his narrative even as his body underwent changes beyond his power to prevent. The glove was the first time, he told a trusted friend during the preparation for what would have been his This Is It residency, that I understood how to use what was happening to me instead of just having it happen. That's when I knew I would survive it all. Not just the vitiligo, but everything that came with being who I am in the world's eye. His prediction proved both prescient and tragically limited. The artistic resilience that had allowed him to transform medical necessity into iconic signature, the creative vision that had repeatedly converted constraint into innovation. These aspects of his character remained intact until the end. But the physical resilience required to withstand decades of unrelenting scrutiny, of public dissection, of the particular pressure that accompanies unprecedented fame, ultimately proved finite. When he passed away in June 2009, the obituaries and tributes invariably mentioned the single white glove among his most recognizable attributes. Few connected it to the vitiligo confirmed in his autopsy report, to the medical reality that had shaped his physical transformation. The narrative of deliberate racial rejection, of self-hatred, of artificial alteration proved more sensational, more aligned with the tabloid construction of Michael Jackson that had increasingly overshadowed the human being beneath the mythology. For those who had known the truth, who had witnessed the glove's conception as creative response to unwanted physical change, there was particular poignancy in how completely its origin story had been obscured by more dramatic, less accurate explanations. The assistant who had been present in that New York hotel suite, who had watched the transformation of medical consultation into creative collaboration, found herself thinking about that night as she watched the global outpouring of grief that followed Michael's death. The saddest part, she told her husband as they watched yet another television special filled with speculation about Michael's physical changes, is that the truth was actually more human, more relatable, more universal than all these wild theories. He was just a young man dealing with a skin condition that was particularly difficult given his fame, finding a creative way to address it on his own terms. Isn't that actually more interesting, more moving than all this invented drama? Her question cuts to the heart of how we construct narratives around public figures, particularly those whose talents seem to place them in a category apart from ordinary humanity. The truth of the glove's origin, as creative response to the beginning stages of vitiligo, as transformation of medical necessity into artistic signature, offers a window into the human being behind the performance, into the universal experience of navigating unwanted change, of finding ways to maintain agency when circumstances beyond our control alter fundamental aspects of our lives. That this narrative proved less compelling to media outlets than sensationalized alternative speaks not to its inherent interest, but to our collective reluctance to recognize genuine humanity in those we elevate to iconic status. Years after Michael's death, one of his original rhinestone gloves sold at auction for $350,000. Its value derived primarily from its association with iconic performances, with cultural moments that had helped define a generation's relationship with music and movement. The buyer, a wealthy collector of music memorabilia, displayed it in a custom-built glass case with museum-quality lighting, the perfect presentation of historic artifact. What remained invisible in this careful presentation was the glove's origin story, how it had begun not as deliberate fashion statement, but as creative solution to the early stages of vitiligo, how it represented not just iconic performance, but human resilience, the transformation of private struggle into public art. This deeper narrative, known to few but integral to understanding the glove's full significance, remained largely untold, overshadowed by the simpler story of aesthetic choice, of distinctive style, of iconic accessory adopted by a performer known for unprecedented attention to visual detail. If this video has touched you, if it has provided deeper understanding of the human story behind an iconic image, please like and subscribe. Share it with someone who appreciates that our most distinctive creations often emerge from our most challenging circumstances, that what appears as a stylistic choice may represent creative response to unwanted change. And remember that behind the public personas of even our most celebrated cultural figures lie human beings navigating the same fundamental challenges we all face. The need to maintain dignity and agency amid circumstances beyond our control, to transform what happens to us into expressions of who we are. In a small, private collection of Michael Jackson memorabilia maintained by his estate, one particular glove holds special significance. Not the most elaborately decorated, not the one worn during the most famous performances, but the original prototype created in those weeks after the New York hotel meeting. Unlike the versions that followed, this one bears the interior label with a simple instruction: right hand only, fitted to skin condition areas. These words, visible only when the glove is turned inside out, provide the most direct connection to its origin as medical necessity transformed into artistic signature. The curator who oversees this collection, one of the few people with knowledge of the glove's complete history, occasionally shows it to scholars of music history, to costume designers studying the evolution of stage wear, to graduate students researching the intersection of art and identity. Without explicitly connecting it to Michael's vitiligo, respecting in death the privacy he sought in life regarding his medical condition, she nevertheless emphasizes its significance as creative response to personal challenge. The most powerful aspects of artistic identity, she tells these visitors, often emerge from the places where necessity meets invention, where private reality transforms into public expression. This glove represents that moment for Michael Jackson, when something that began as concealment became revelation of a different kind, when covering what he didn't want seen created something new that everyone wanted to see. In these moments of quiet education, of passing knowledge to those who will shape future understanding of cultural history, the glove's complete story, both its surface sparkle that captivated millions and its deeper significance as creative response to vitiligo's early stages, finds continuation, ensuring that the human truth behind the iconic image remains accessible to those who seek understanding beyond the simplified narratives of celebrity culture. This truth, like the glove itself, contains both concealment and revelation, both protection and expression, both private struggle and public art. The complex duality that defined not just a fashion choice, but a human being navigating extraordinary circumstances with creative resilience that transformed challenge into lasting cultural signature.